Good evening. It's nice to see as many of you here as are here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Denise Daniels. I'm a professor of management in the School of Business, Government, and Economics here at SPU. And it's really my great privilege to be able to introduce our speaker to you all tonight. Before I do that, I just wanted to give a quick thank you to the Faith and Science Club for helping to sponsor this event and for all the snacks outside that you guys had a chance, hopefully, to grab before you came in. So thank you very much to that club and for the work that you've done in letting people know about this event as well. So it's my great privilege to introduce to you Elaine Howard Ecklund. Many of you have maybe read a little bit about her. Maybe you have had a chance to talk with faculty about her, or maybe you haven't. So for those of you, regardless of what you may already know, let me tell you a little bit about her. She is a professor at Rice University in sociology. That's her discipline. She's technically the Herbert S. Autry Chair in Social Sciences at Rice, which is kind of a big deal. When you get a named chair like that, that means that you've done something pretty remarkable. And Elaine has indeed done some remarkable things in her career. She has published a number of books. One of her earlier books was the title was Science versus Religion, What Scientists Really Think. That came out in 2010. That was chosen by the Times Higher Education as an International Book of the Week and named a Book of the Year on Religion by the Huffington Post. So it got quite a bit of play by both academics and in the popular press. She has written another book that just came out last month called Religion versus Science, What People of Faith, actually I'm saying the subtitle wrong, Religion versus Science, What Religious People Really Think. And it's kind of the other perspective. So what do people of faith think about what scientists do? And she's going to talk a little bit about that book tonight. Last year she also published a book called Failing Families, Failing Science, Work-Family Conflict in Academic Science, which talks about the challenges that scientists in academic contexts face trying to juggle and manage both their work and their calling and their family lives. And she'll talk about that book a bit tonight as well. In addition to the books that she has published, she has also been the recipient of a number of grants, and I'm going to just list for you some of the granting agencies that have found her work worthy of funding. That includes the National Science Foundation, the Russell Sage Foundation, the John Templeton Foundation, the Templeton World Charity Foundation, the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, and the Lilly Endowment. So you can get a sense of the scope with which she works. So obviously she's a sociologist, but she's done work in the area of science, and I know a number of you are probably here from a science background, and some of you are here from a sociology perspective. I had the privilege of getting to know Elaine over several years. We were together on a long-term project, and we realized that we had some really similar interests and decided to work on a project together. So she and I, she's actually in town right now because we're in the process of gathering some data for a project on faith and work. And obviously my discipline, which is management, is not science, but I'm interested in how people think about their work broadly. And so she's starting a project, and I'm having the chance to work with her on that project as we gather data. So she's very accomplished, has interests in lots of different domains, and I think you'll have you'll be very interested in hearing what she has to say. She's going to talk for about 30 minutes, and at the end of that time, you'll have a chance for a question and answer. We are recording this for folks who couldn't be here tonight, so when we do get to the end and there is an opportunity for Q&A, we're going to ask folks who want to ask questions to come up and use one of the handheld mics, and we'll have a couple people up here facilitating that. So without further ado, let me introduce you and have you welcome Dr. Elaine Howard Ecklund.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's a real privilege. Thank you to Professor Daniels and to Professor Walsh-Scheffler and to Professor McKinney, who've really done a lot of work. Is my mic on?
Can you guys hear in the back? I'm not sure if the mic is on.
Can't see her though.
You might want
You
to
can't see me? Okay. So really appreciate being here. I was just telling the colleagues that SPU is a very special place. I hope you still can't hear me, huh? Is the mic not on? How's that? There we go. Great. I was telling the colleagues that SPU is a very special place because all dinner when I met with these three colleagues, they were talking about specific students and the kinds of things that they're doing with students. For the students in the room, your professors care about you a lot. And I think in universities, generally that's true, but I really sense that energy here, that the faculty really care for the students, and that this is a really generative learning environment. So it's a really special place to be. So thank you for having me. I also want to thank some other contributors to this specific work. So these two books that I'm going to touch on a little bit tonight were funded. The research that contributed to the books was funded by the John Templeton Foundation and the National Science Foundation. And Rice University also provided some smaller funds to get those grants, so some pilot research. And of course, I want to thank Seattle Pacific University for being here. So the first book that I'm going to walk you through a little bit is called Failing Families, Failing Science, Work, Family Conflict, and Academic Science. And my husband is a particle physicist, so he smashes things through the around. I'm really not up on what he actually does, even though we've been married for 17 years. He smashes things. That was not a good lead into what he does. But he studies particles. He studies fundamental particles, and he never comes home and says, like my research subjects said X to me, right? His particles do not talk back to him. But this is one of the really lovely things about being a sociologist, is that we study people. And the research subjects that we study talk back to us, and they really tell us things about how the social world works. And they bring insights into our research that are really, really powerful. And so this first book, I remember one of the very first interviews that I did was with a woman who is an entomologist. So she studied bugs. And I went into her office, and there was a picture of an arachnid a very particular kind of bug that she studied on her wall. So there's a big picture of a bug. And as we got talking, I was there to talk to her about gender and family life and other kinds of related things and how they had an impact or didn't on her scientific career. And I found out that she had just had a baby 6 weeks ago. And interestingly, on that particular trip, I was there as well, and I had just had a baby about 3 months ago, and that was one of the first professional trips that I made after I had my baby. And in my office, at Rice University, there were pictures of it was like a little shrine, actually. There were pictures of my baby every place, just like her, smiling, her not smiling, her with my husband, her, with other baby friends, just sort of like really just like all over the office. And it really struck me that this woman had had this baby and didn't even have a single picture of the baby in the office. And I just got thinking, what kind of work environment is it such that she didn't, and I don't really know it, as it came out further, it was that she felt that she really could not advertise the fact that she was a new mother. She didn't have any pictures of her baby because she kind of felt some subtle pressure. It wasn't as if anyone said overtly, never put up pictures of your children in your office, but she kind of felt like she didn't really want to be viewed as too much of a mommy kind of person. So here are some of the questions that we set out to study, my co-author and I, Ann Lincoln. So how do scientists, both men and women, experience gender and family life in science? And then here's a question that I'm thinking about tonight as someone who is herself a Christian, who's very invested in her own church, as someone who wants to see churches really care for the world in profound ways. So I'm asking myself, what can I learn and what can churches learn for this research? This was not research that was specifically about church people or Christians in particular. In fact, I'm pretty sure that most of the people I interviewed wouldn't consider themselves Christians, but I think there's something that the church can learn from these data as well. So the study focused at first in very quantitative ways, numerical ways, was a survey of 3,455 US biologists and physicists at top research universities. So places like Stanford or University of Michigan, the kinds of places that we studied scientists. We did in-depth conversations with people who took the survey. So Surveys, if you've taken a survey, they really box people into answers. So I, as the researcher, decide the whole range of choices that you have on the survey. I decide a priori what your answer options are. But my co-author and I also wanted to know how people talked about these things in their own terms. We wanted to know, for example, if our categories for understanding gender, family life, and science are really what our respondents' categories were. So here's a quote from Jennifer, a physics graduate student we interviewed. She said, "The main discrimination in the sciences I see is this idea that there is an ideal scientist. There's one particular type of person who does science. They like to work 14-hour days and they think in a particular way. And their one and only passion is doing research. I'm not that person, and I wonder if that means I'll never be a good scientist." Meet Arthur, who we also interviewed. He says this: "If you need to be a scientist, it's very helpful to have a very powerful woman. My wife was a CEO, a secretary for our house, and you wouldn't believe it. She ran the company. The boss, meaning me, only signed things, and she keeps doing this," his wife, "still today." These are two very different kinds of quotes that give you some insight into gender and science to some degree. What was surprising to my colleague and I when we studied these scientists is that actually young men who we interviewed for our research were a lot more like Jennifer than they were like Arthur. That young men actually were very invested in the potential of having a family life alongside the academic science career. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. The image of the ideal scientist. So if for those of you who are maybe social scientists in the room, this sort of ideal, typical image, what we're all aspiring to, whether or not it's reality, what we think the ideal ought to be. So both men and women that we talked with in our research lived under what we called the ideal scientist image. This is someone who sees scientific work as a kind of calling. There was, even for these people who were not necessarily spiritual in their own terms, this had a very spiritual sensibility about it, that scientific work was such an important calling that you ought to put scientific work above other kinds of life pursuits, in particular that you ought to put work ahead of family. Seeing long hours is a badge of courage. Really, finding people in our study who would kind of brag about how many hours they'd worked in a particular day to sort of one-upmanship. We found in our research that there is a personal and cultural fatherhood penalty. And I think the things that we found have important lessons for women, but are not particularly surprising to us, but we were able to document things clearly. We did find some things that were quite surprising to us in relationship to men and young men in particular. So we found that science influences family formation, especially people who go on to elite kinds of institutions. More women in particular that we interviewed have fewer children than they wanted because of their science career. But we found that male faculty who have fewer children than they desired are actually less satisfied with their lives than the women in our study. So when we interviewed them, we found that women, for example, never thought that they could have it all. They thought that if they went into elite science that there would be particular kinds of downsides, that they may not get married, that they may not have as many children as they had wanted. Men, however, thought that they could have it all. But we also found that there is an institutional and cultural motherhood penalty, which has huge structural impacts in science. Like these pictures. If you just put like 1950s pictures of mothering, this is the kind of thing that you get. So we found that ideal, in people's mindsets when we interviewed them, that ideal scientists exclusively devote themselves to their work. But we also found in these respondents and in research in our broader US culture that ideal mothers exclusively devote themselves to their children. There is the expectation that wives will care for the household activities and men will act primarily as breadwinners. Now, certainly in our modern day society, this is not even usual anymore. So many women work outside the home that this is not a typical arrangement. But I'm talking about a cultural perception. Still 60% of Americans think that this is best if women primarily devote themselves to children and men primarily devote themselves to breadwinning. But we found amongst our scientist mothers that they really still were expecting themselves, and others were expecting them to fulfill both roles well. This came out in our interviews when we coded our interviews for how men and women described their parenting. Men described their family contributions, even very progressive men described their family contributions as sacrifices, and they felt very proud of the kinds of sacrifices that they made for their families. Women, on the other hand, described themselves as lucky if their partner contributed. So we actually coded what ended up being thousands of pages of interview transcripts, over 150 interviews, for the number of times parenting was described and how it was described. And these two words, sacrifice and lucky, came up over and over again, with men describing their parenting as a sacrifice and women describing men's parenting, if they had an involved male partner, as describing themselves as lucky. So mothers tend to pay the high price in science. So they're 27% less likely to receive tenure than fathers. They're also less likely than married women without children to receive tenure. And 47%, this was interesting, when compared to 0.3%, yes, that's right, 0.3, not 3 even percent, 0.3% of fathers who are full professors feel that they face family discrimination. Here's an assistant professor of biology, Joanne, who says, you don't want to be viewed as too much of a mommy kind of person in this career. You know, you don't want to give off the vibe that you just want to have lots of children. I don't know what that vibe would be exactly, but I think, what would the vibe that you would have lots of children be? I think everyone would frown at you and think you weren't very serious. Here's another professor of biology who says that childcare has been hard, and then just getting everything done is challenging. I've chosen not to travel very much. My husband helps out a lot by picking up the kids from school, and then the teachers don't know me. They still refuse to put my husband's name as the primary contact on the school form, even though he's more involved in the school. So I'm going to come back to some of the things that I think that particular book has made me reflect on, especially when I think about my own life as a parent and as a professional, as well as what I think churches can be reflecting on. I think it's a very special opportunity for me to be at this particular institution tonight talking about these kinds of things where we can have a freer kind of conversation about, in particular, how churches ought to respond. But I want to move now to talking just a little bit about this other book, Religion versus Science, What Religious People Really Think. And as Professor Daniels said, this is the opposite for me, and in some ways a kind of integration of the other book that I wrote really almost 8 years ago now, called Science versus Religion, What Scientists Really Think, and which made me wonder if the kinds of stereotypes that scientists had about people of faith, and Christians in particular, were accurate. And so my co-author and I, Christopher Scheidel, wanted to really delve into that. So let me share just a little bit about that with you now, turn into this other project. So again, a story that kind of helped me delve into this research. So I think I start the book out with this story for those of you who are read it. I was at Cornell University doing some PhD work, and my advisor had me at the time going to Bible studies as part of my PhD work. So she wanted me to figure out what Christians think about changes in family forms, so increase in single parents, in same-sex couples raising children. So that was the particular topic that we were studying. And as I was in one of these research Bible studies, so I was there to do research, I met a woman, and she asked me what I was doing, so what I was doing professionally. I said, well, I'm a PhD student at Cornell University. And she said, yuck, I wouldn't want my kids to go to Cornell University. And the first thing that went through my mind was like, oh, I guess Cornell's not good enough. You want them to go to Harvard? Like what? You know, so I was sort of like really not tracking with her. I was feeling kind of defensive because I was a Cornell student, but it's sort of a defensive in a kind of elitist way. And I said, well, tell me more. You know, what do you hope for them? And she said, well, I wouldn't want my kids to go there because they might take science classes. I was like, wow, okay, tell me more. So she said, well, I'm pretty sure that if they take science classes from Cornell University professors, that they will take them away, that these professors will take my children away from the faith. So I want them to go to a different kind of school where the science professors won't try to really take my children away from their faith. And I got thinking, wow, that is really fascinating. That had not been my experience with Cornell University professors, that they were kind of out to eat young Christian children for lunch. So that's where you have this kind of experience where like, wow, I really want to study that and see if that's typical, if this woman's views are typical, what's really going on in the science community. Are there scientists who are Christians? And I just thought, gosh, I got to study more of this. And that really led me on a kind of 10-year journey that I've been on, studying faith and science. So here's this most recent book. We have a lot of stereotypes and caricatures, right? So here's Richard Dawkins, the author of The God Delusion, who you probably know, who said that faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. So maybe people of faith are not very reasonable, that they're not able to evaluate evidence well. And then there's Ken Ham, who maybe some of you know of, who's founder of the Creation Museum, who says believing in a relatively young earth, over a few thousand of years old, which we accept, is a consequence of accepting the authority of the Word of God as an infallible revelation from an omniscient creator. So this woman that I met at the Bible study was not crazy. I mean, if she looked in the popular media around her, particularly at the time that I was doing that study, about 12, 13 years ago now, where there were school board cases about teaching evolution in the public schools, and there was kind of tension around that issue in particular. We wouldn't think of her as a crazy person. She had some reason to believe maybe scientists are against people of faith. So here are the questions that my co-author and I ask in this particular book. So some of the questions. So what do religious people think about science and scientists? So we focused in this book on all versions of Christianity, but also on Islam and on Jews, so just the versions of those groups that are most populous in the US. And then how should Christians think about science? So the work that my colleague and I did was not particularly prescriptive, but I think you can use it in a way that's deeply prescriptive. So research can be good news that we can use in our church context if we choose to use it that way. So here's the study, just in brief. We did a nationally representative survey. So we surveyed over 10,000. This is a general population survey. And we actually took into our sample an extra number of scientists. So because we wanted to in particular figure out what rank and file scientists. So remember, in some of my previous research, I studied scientists at elite institutions in particular. So I wanted to also look at people who might be more likely to be in the pews. So people who work across different sectors in our society, say in research and development in a corporation or in a hospital or just outside the university in particular. We then went into congregations, and this for my team and I, Esther Chan is here, who was very involved in this study. We went into congregations of all types, and this was so much fun. So we studied 23 congregations, which is actually a huge amount of work, which took a several-year period. And then we did in-depth interviews with people in the congregations. And we wanted, in this particular study, to look at evangelicals, mainline Protestants, and Catholics, and we wanted racial diversity in our sample. So most of the conversation about faith and science has really focused implicitly on white Christians in particular, and we wanted to make sure we had historically black churches and Latino Catholic and Latino evangelical churches in particular, as well as Asian American churches and people in our sample. We found that Christians are very supportive of science. And actually, I was not deeply surprised by this. I mean, I married a physicist and we met each other in a Christian fellowship group at our university. So, I mean, I know they're out there, right? Glad for me. But what I think the media has been very surprised by this finding from our study. If you Google my name in religion and science, you'll see that I've given several interviews recently where I've just said, like, over and over in various ways during the course of the interview, yes, religious people in general and Christians, even Christians in particular, even conservative Christians in particular, are quite supportive of science. And sort of, it may not be news to the people in this room, but it apparently is news to some others, showing that there's this kind of cultural perception out there that Christians perhaps are not so supportive of science. So here's just a bit of evidence. If you read the book, there's a lot more in there, and we have a lot of research articles too on my website if you're deeply interested in the statistics of this. But here's just a couple of touch points for you. So we asked how interested our respondents are in various things, and we found that this is I actually didn't even collapse those who are somewhat interested and very interested when the numbers go up to be quite large, but just those who are very interested in new scientific discoveries. So evangelical Protestants, those who feel comfortable with that label, 22% say they're very interested in new scientific discoveries, 28% of mainline Protestants. You'll see it's even more for Jews and for Catholics and for the non-religious and for those who are part of what, sadly, because there are such small numbers, I've collapsed into this group called non-Western religions. So, but when you go to looking at medical discoveries, so we asked our respondents, please tell me how interested you are in new medical discoveries, and we found that 37% of evangelical Protestants and 39% of mainline Protestants are very interested in new medical discoveries. And we did found that said to us that there do seem to be some difference in interest levels for issues that aren't clearly connected to real-world applications. So here's where there does seem to be some kind of religious difference that's interesting to us. And this comes out in our interviews pretty strongly, that Christians in particular want to make change in the world for social good. And so my co-author, Christopher Scheidel, has written some about this in some research articles on college majors, and finding that Christian students are much more likely to major in majors that are perceived as helping the world rather than, say, basic science. And so they're more likely to be pre-med than, say, physics. And so that's kind of interesting and something for us to interrogate. So how could we make it more appealing, if we so want, in churches to think abstract science is a good thing or could be used to help the world. So that's kind of something interesting to muse on for me. So here's another question. So overall, modern science does more harm than good. So this is kind of a forced answer question where we assert something strongly to the respondent and then we ask their opinion on it. And we found that 85% of all Americans disagree with this. So in general, modern science has a pretty positive place in our society. Christians don't differ. 86% of evangelical Christians disagree that overall science does more harm than good. But there still are some problems, right? And the problems with science seem to hinge on these two particular theological issues. I just got some nasty email from a couple of scientists because I gave an interview to our local paper, the Houston Chronicle. I said that scientists ought to go to church to actually investigate if they want to be serious about doing scientific research on the social public that they seem to think disagree with them, that maybe they ought to go to church and meet people who are Christians and try to understand why they have problems with the particular aspects of science that they do. And so that particular quote, scientists should go to church, was taken out of context and really amplified. So, yeah. So the problems with science hinge on these two things, the view of God and the view of humans. So no problems with the science around refrigeration. No one's out picketing about that or saying, like, refrigeration, I think it's a bad thing. I mean, you kind of see where I'm going with this. Or no one is has morally opposed to the kinds of technologies that go to the automobile or other. I mean, there's all kinds of science and technology things that we completely take for granted in our society and that we generally think are extremely positive. And people who are religious, particularly Christians, don't differ any from the general public on these kinds of things. They all view science pretty positively, and technology in particular. But these beginning of life technologies, so in our book we go through several scientific issues that where Christians in particular seem to have some kind of tension or at least give pause. Beginning of life technologies, so I'm thinking about things like reproductive genetic technologies, so making changes perhaps in vitro or even pre-in vitro. Which can, rectify some types of disease, or some of these aren't able to be applied yet, but are on the horizon, what we might call enhancement technologies. So this is a kind of colloquial expression, but perhaps you prefer a child that has blue eyes rather than brown eyes, or brown eyes rather than blue. Would there be the possibility, this is on the horizon, of selecting for these kinds of things? in vitro fertilization, a reproductive technology, human embryonic stem cell research, which you've heard probably a lot about in the news as well. So these kinds of things cause particular religious groups pause. Actually, Jews, Muslims, and Christians of all types, these particular technologies cause them some pause. But evangelicals in particular, so 66% of evangelicals think that most forms of human reproductive genetic technologies are morally wrong. And 46% of mainline Protestants say that they're morally wrong. But this is compared to only 20% of the non-religious. And we do more complex statistical analyses kind of teasing out some of these things in the book. But on the face of it, there's some big religious differences there when it comes to these kind of technologies, which we would traditionally think of as the beginning of life technologies. So this is where it seems to kind of the rubber meets the road, that some of these beginning of life technologies seem to imply a playing God for certain religious people. So here's a man who goes to an evangelical church who says, I referenced the Tower of Babel a little bit earlier, and people tried to build a tower so high that they could get to God, that they could be equal with God. And I think when we start playing God with human genetics, we are doing the same thing. We're putting ourselves equal with God, so I think that would be sinful. This playing God motif came up a lot in our research. Here's another one, a mainline Protestant. It says the idea of human beings fucking around with our genomes to basically really completely and totally make ourselves God. That scares me a little. Or I think it actually scares him a lot. I think that is a really dangerous road we're going down, in part because of the theological implications. It's a pretty extraordinary form of idolatry, and this is coming from someone who's part of a mainline Protestant church. The uniqueness of humans. So really the thesis of our book is that it's about God and humans, and the theology that really is indicating. So people they're not entirely just having knee-jerk reactions, that they think the science has some kinds of implications for these very important theological ideas. So another evangelical Christian says, I don't consider myself extremely knowledgeable, but according to the Bible, human life is sacred. And I believe, based on my study of the Bible, that human life begins at conception. So anytime after conception, if you're engaging in a practice that could lead to the destruction of human life, given that definition, I think that's a problem. Another issue, of course, is evolution. And here's where we did something that's a little bit unconventional in this research, and we borrowed this approach from Jonathan Hill, my colleague at Calvin College, who gives people 6 narratives and when we ask them in the survey about evolution. So on one end is the God created the universe, the earth, and all of life within the past 10,000 years, so kind of traditional young earth perspective. To the other end, evolution without involvement of God, the universe and earth came into being billions of years ago. All life, including humans, evolved over millions of years from earlier life forms due to environmental pressure to adapt. There was no God or intelligent force involved in either the creation or evolution of life. So my co-author and I, as well as Jonathan Hill, the scholar I just mentioned, think that a lot of the questions that survey researchers have asked about evolution have been pretty problematic, have not given people a variety of choices that really allowed them to answer these questions in a nuanced way. So another thing that we did, which was kind of different, is we didn't force people to choose only one thing. We allowed them, if you wanted to say, like, I believe all 6 of these a little bit, you could. We found that people are incredibly inconsistent. So people did, they are only consistent when we as researchers make them be consistent or pretend that they're consistent. So people actually did choose both of these things, both the young earth and the evolution with no God. But we found that nearly 40% of evangelicals actually couldn't commit as a true believer to any single perspective on the origin of life, although evangelicals also were the group that was most likely to commit to the young earth for those who did commit. And so that was kind of interesting to us. And here's where the interviews became super instructive, because we found that the evolutionary science really didn't matter as much as the particular perspective, if the particular perspective of evolution allowed for God. And so the whole idea is that evolution was problematic only in as much as it seemed to kind of be messing around with the uniqueness of humans and the involvement of God in the world. And there's people who've written tons on this, and I can point you to particular books that are good, but this is what we found. This is what our social science research showed. So here's an evangelical Christian who said the idea of a creator, was a creator behind evolution, or is there a creator or not, is more important. Could a creator have used evolution as a means to create man or something? Sure, why not? But I think, is there a creator is a much more important question. So you can see the kind of how people are struggling with that particular question, whether or not evolution allows for God. And then the uniqueness of humans as well. And I put up a quote from a rabbi just to show that this was a very liberal rabbi. I went on to talk with her about all kinds of issues, and she would definitely come on the liberal side of things theologically. But she too, she said, we don't get too hung up on any of these specific details when talking about evolution, but they read about a plan, that God had a plan, and human beings created in the image of God. So even she is kind of saying, well, really, evolution still needs to allow for human beings to be created in the image of God, and of course for God's particular kind of plan. And here's a Latino Christian from a Catholic church who says, we believe that we're made in the image of God. So my physical form, or whatever, the physiology of man, can change over a lifetime, and we'll probably keep doing so. But this doesn't affect anything of who we come from or where we're going. I'm not going to change my opinion if someone comes and says we were created out of nothing. This is an interesting quote to me, and this came up in other interviews as well, because some of the scientists I talk with for my other research think that convincing particular groups of religious people about evolution is only a matter of providing them better and more accurate information. They sort of want, the techniques of evolution need to be explained better. And I think that that's partly right, but these data also show that understanding something and assenting to it are perhaps two different kinds of cognitive processes. And that the scientists who are saying it's just a matter of giving more information also need to understand the kind of underlying reasons that some people are rejecting evolution and what's at stake for them. So when I'm giving these data and talks to the science community, I said, well, you need to understand, it's not helpful to say, oh, you're dumb, you don't know enough, right? That's not a helpful rhetoric. Instead, we need to be asking, well, what's at stake for you, right? And trying to understand some of those underlying reasons. So I said Christians, really are on board with science, but perhaps related to the uniqueness of humans and the allowance for the intervention of God, Christians have the perception that scientists are kind of against them, and they, for their part, do not always trust scientists. So this came out in these data quite a bit, that there is a general sense amongst the Christians that we studied, and really evangelicals in particular, but also Catholics and even some mainline Protestants, that scientists are perhaps against them, do not have the best interests of religious people in mind, or are perhaps even morally biased. So we asked them, so to what extent do you think scientists are hostile to religion? So 36% of evangelical Christians think that most scientists are hostile to religion. Here's an evangelical from a largely Latino congregation who says, I guess that scientists do have an agenda of trying to disprove God. In these next couple of quotes, I point out the ethnic and racial background of the respondent, because we did find that these kinds of sentiments tended to come up in Latino and historically black congregations, in particular, this perception that scientists were perhaps against them. And this person says, I wonder if certain scientists are against Christians. 60% of evangelicals think that scientists should be open to considering miracles in their work. So when I assert statistics that say Christians are pro-science, some scientists say, when I give this statistic, well, what kind of science is it that they're in favor of? This doesn't seem like real science if they wanted to allow for miracles. Here's a respondent from a largely black church who says that, I think that especially in science, people would be more apt to find a bone in the ground and say, this is the missing link. This is what proves evolution. We can finally shut up those rotten Christians. So here are some things I'm learning. This is by no means the entirety of these two books. I just kind of picked out some snippets of things that I thought would be interesting to share with you tonight. But here are some things that I've been thinking about from my particular standpoint As a person who's been a Christian for quite a while and also is very involved in her church, here's some things from my research that I want the church to struggle with, or that I'm struggling with in the midst of my church. I think as Christians that we ought to have a concern for changing our institutions. We don't tend to talk very much about that in most churches. We tend to dwell a lot on change in the individual person, and I think that's extremely important. Each of us has a very unique and personal faith narrative and faith journey. But there's also a place for structural change, and that's where I think sociology can be a very helpful corrective in focusing us back to the institutional and to the structural. So what can we do to change our universities? So we're in a university. Some of us will end up in universities long term. So when it comes to these family life kinds of issues, I started thinking through my study of family, gender, and science about how I could think about equality of access to childcare in my particular university context. So our university, for example, provides a daycare, which is amazing. Most universities do not have this as a resource. So my daughter, from the time she was 3 months until she was age 5, actually went to our on-campus university daycare, which allowed me to breastfeed her for quite a long time because she, are you allowed to say breastfeeding in a public environment? So, right, put it right out there. So I'm looking around and wondering for how many of you this is relevant, but that's all right. Just put it right out there. So that's a really cool thing. If you're not there yet, you may be or may know someone who is. So that's neat. But the university, the on-campus daycare is so darned expensive that only professors can afford it, and not graduate students and even postdoctoral fellows. So what would it mean? What would it mean for me as a tenured professor at my university, someone who has lifetime employment, unless I commit some kind of morally egregious act. What would it mean for me to fight for equality of access to childcare for people who have less resources in my particular university environment? And non-standard childcare benefits. I think this is important not just in universities, but in many sectors of the corporate world. In some ways, corporate sector is doing better than some universities along these lines. So when you have to travel for work, for example, is there funding to bring along a nanny with you if you have to take a young child, or if you have a sick child and you have to be at work? Another thing that my university does, which is really wonderful, is provides a certain number of what we call backup childcare hours for faculty, where you have as part of your healthcare benefit that you can call this hotline if you have to teach a class or do something else for your professional work as a professor, and they'll send over a care provider if you have a sick child. I mean, that's extraordinary. So companies have done that, but universities are just starting to do that kind of thing, non-standard childcare benefits. And then I think institutionally in our churches, are there ways in which churches in particular can support scientists as a people group? So would there be structural ways? I gave some of these data from the Failing Families, Failing Science book at Yale University to their Christian Medical and Dental Society group several years back. And it was a really neat kind of conversation because there were both people who are part of church communities and people who weren't in the same room. And we got into kind of interesting conversation about, well, what would people who don't go to church want from churches in terms of helping them with family life and really helping, say, parents, both of whom are in graduate school or both of whom are postdoctoral fellows, really stay in the sciences when they have young children. So what could churches do in terms of providing daycare? What could this be kind of a missional outreach to the scientific community? And then something which I've been thinking about a lot recently is the whole issue of justice in science, and in particular minority representation in science. And let me tell you a little bit about that. And I think the church can have a really special role here. So these groups are underrepresented in science. So Christians are underrepresented in science. Non-whites, particularly Black Christians and Latinos, are vastly underrepresented in science. So depending on what kind of polls you look at and how you measure religious participation, we've got over 85%, some over 90% of African Americans think of themselves as Christians to a certain extent. Yet this is a group that less than 1% of whom are in the science community, especially at elite research universities. And I think this is a very, very serious justice issue. And so what could the church do? In Houston, in my particular city, Latino and African American congregations are huge providers of after-school programs for families. That we have some very prominent and amazing churches in our community that are just doing the lion's share of after-school provision, providing 2 or 3 hours of after-school. Could those particular after-school programs be utilized for science enrichment in some kind of special way? So what would it mean as a church to imagine maybe churches which have more science resources teaming together with churches who have other kinds of resources? So sort of thinking about that kind of imagination. I'm in a group right now that is working with a private school actually in Houston to try to sponsor a STEM program this summer for kids who wouldn't necessarily have a high education place to go during the summer. And so what would it mean for churches to be participating in what I would think of as science justice? This quote from an African-American pastor I interviewed is particularly troubling for me, when he said, "Science still, for a lot of African Americans, is a no trespassing zone." I could go on and on about this. Our team is doing some very specific research in this area right now. And then I think at the more cultural or interpretive level, I've been thinking a lot about how we can tell different kind of stories about the good. And this is where I think the Christian notion of redemption is extremely important here when we think about things like justice in science, when we think about faith in science. So how can we be a people group that tell different kinds of stories than the common cultural narratives that we hear? So I want to think some about what godly ambition means. So the gender in science and the faith in science work have kind of melded together in my mind, but I don't hear very much in our churches about women being ambitious and what that might mean for women to be ambitious in a church environment. I don't hear stories of that. What would that mean to tell those kinds of stories? We usually think, both in our university context, there's so many times that I've heard colleagues say, I have these kids and they're a problem for my work, for these particular kinds of problems, but what would it mean to think of our children as a blessing to our work? What would that mean to tell a different kind of narrative about the ways in which having children can enrich our work? I had this really lovely interview with a woman who's a scientist who had just had a child and said that the particular kind of scientific work that she did with cell cultures had really changed since she'd had a child, and she thought of herself as nurturing those cultures in a kind of different and innovative way that she learned as a parent. And that's kind of an odd term, meaning that I don't hear it very often amongst the scientists, and I've interviewed over 1,000 scientists, and I've not heard very many talk about their scientific work, that participating in their scientific work is a form of nurture. But I thought that was a very interesting way of cultivating a different kind of story in the scientific environment, where we think about science and family life as really enriching each other. And then stories about work and family as both men's and women's issues. So that this work-family tension is not just a woman's issue, but that it's an issue for people, right? And so how do we think about that in telling a different kind of story about whose concern work and family together are? And then when it comes to science and faith, what would it mean to think about science and faith as not just a struggle, but are there ways in which we could think about science and faith in our church communities? Could we tell stories of collaboration? Could we be honest about tensions? So the first time that a student has any kind of tension with faith and science shouldn't be in a university classroom. It should be when they're age 7 in a youth group, when they're starting to ask hard questions of the faith, right? Those should be safe places where we can tell our stories of tension and struggle, but then also have people tell their stories of collaboration and beauty. So I think those are important things to think about. So I think I will leave us there, and really love to have your conversation and your questions if we have time for that at this point. So thank you.
So as we mentioned, we're going to have people with questions to just come down to the bottom of the aisle, I think, and Dr. McKinney will be on this side and I will be on this side. And of course, we would like to open up questions to students first. So if you are a student and have a question for Dr. Ecklund, please come forward.
They have to walk forward, all right. Yeah. I'm going to open the LaCroix now. All right, there. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I'll come back here. Yeah. Thank you.
Is it appropriate to ask of your data why the church and people in the church have found mistrust with scientists specifically, but not the discipline of science?
Yeah. So these, I hate to tell you this, but social science can never tell you anything 100%, right? There's sort of some like directions. So here's two things that I think are going on from the data I've collected over the past 10 years. It seems from our data that Christians do not know very many scientists. So we have different ways of measuring this, but they have low relational networks when it comes to scientists. They don't know very many of them. It seems, yet, I find through my studies of scientists that there are Christians who are scientists, so where are they? It seems from interviewing them that they don't feel very comfortable talking about their scientific work in church. So those two things seem to be going on, that they perhaps are participating, but they don't feel comfortable talking about their particular work. So I think there needs to be more effort perhaps made in the part of church leaders or particular congregations that would allow scientists to feel more comfortable talking about their work in a church context. It seems very, very important. It almost seems like in this day and age that this is a special role that scientists might need to have, where they're bringing their science to church in a really profound way, right? So I'm involved in some of, actually, my husband and I actually lead a program at our church that's part of a larger movement that some churches have been involved in called Science in Congregations, where we have scientists share about their work in the church, and then for churches that don't have very many scientists, we export ours over there. Sorry, that's kind of thinking about ways of getting scientists out sharing about their work.
Faith communities that were more open to the concept of science, specifically Jewish communities and quote-unquote non-Western communities, were there any common variables in terms of relationship to scientists or faith approach to thinking about certain things that you guys found?
Yeah, there's a really cool organization called Sinai and Synapses that it's run by Rabbi Jeff Middleman. It's located primarily in New York City, and so they're doing a lot around this issue, and they have a really neat website if you want to hear multiple Jewish perspectives on science. But some of our most famous scientists have been Jewish, and there is a real history in that particular tradition of fostering science and a commitment to science. For horrific reasons, scientists who are Jewish were pushed to the US. And so there's also has been a real pipeline of Jewish scientists migrating to the US. So there are historical reasons for that as well, why Judaism in the US in particular is so science friendly. But there has not been a historical tradition of conflict in the same way that there has been in certain Christian communities. And there's probably historians in the room who could speak to this much more intelligently than I can. But there's a couple of things there that I think are really important. Yeah. And I will say briefly that in Islam, in not so much in the US, but in other national contexts, that Muslims are having also struggles with science in the same kinds of ways that some evangelical groups are in the US. So there's a lot of discussion about Islam and science in the UK in particular, where there's a large number of Muslim immigrants. And in our team has just finished up an 8-country study of scientists' attitudes towards religion, which Esther was also a big part of. And that in that particular study, we found that Muslim conflict with science came out quite a bit. So, but just not in the U.S. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
So kind of large scale, this book is about religion versus science and how that kind of dichotomy is continuing to widen and kind of affect each other in this kind of dance. But when I think about kind of the core of that, I get really curious about a lot of things. The first is that this doesn't seem like a new problem. In fact, this seems like an 80-year-old problem that a lot of our 20th century history was essentially about at its greatest scales, which was if you took the extremes of science, which is, well, this is what is, and you don't really matter, and then the extreme of religion, which is, this is what you are. And it seems like when you pull those things as far apart as they get, you get those extremes. And I'm wondering why the US and Europe has had this problem of kind of melding these together when it seems like in places that this conflict had happened in the 20th century, like Germany and Russia, and nowadays the fastest growing Christian community being China, I'm kind of curious as to what makes those climates so different socially as the one we have here, and how that affects this conversation.
Yeah. So there are some very particular historic factors related to the Enlightenment which led to a particular kind of conflict narrative. So I would say that I'm not sure I entirely agree with your framing historically. This book is not about any of that, by the way, but I'm just more musing about broader things I've had some exposure to. So that there did not seem to be much of a conflict between Christianity and science for much of our early and mid-Christian history. So in fact, a kind of extreme collaboration where scientists thought of themselves as very much exploring God and their faith through science. And so there's kind of a historical movement then towards conflict, and perhaps now a kind of movement away from that in some corners. So I do think that's a kind of interesting, but that's a better question for a historian about the particular historical factors that led to that. We're finding in our studies of other national contexts that there is a conflict framing, but about different kinds of issues. So India has been a really interesting place to study because there isn't within the Hindu tradition an idea of conflict between knowledge structures, but yet there are societal conflicts about faith and science that have to do with things like, is astrology a science or not? Which most Americans don't think that's like an issue at all, that you would even talk about. And so, but like evolution is not really an issue for them. So there are different kinds of cultural contexts that have a different kind of impact on the faith, science, and relationship. I think is a good take-home point.
You mentioned that in some of your data, it came out that religious people who oppose, say, evolution wouldn't have their minds changed by another piece of data or better data. Did you get any information from them as to what would persuade them to change their mind, or how, and maybe not necessarily that particular topic, but in general?
So knowing a scientist who's an evolutionary biologist who's in the worship band at your church is kind of a kitschy way to say it, right? So people are, in our study shows this to some extent, and other research I think has shown this in even greater extent than ours has, that people are often persuaded by relational networks. So having, if you have an identity that's similar to the person, so say we both have the same religious identity, but you're also a scientist, because I trust your underlying faith identity, then I'm more likely to listen to the pieces of your scientist identity that I would disagree with in other conditions if I just met a random scientist who I didn't share my faith identity. And so that's why I think these relational networks, so it's almost like the relationship has to come first and then the information passes over the relational conduit. I think is something that sociologists are and social psychologists, even more importantly, probably are finding to some extent. Oh my gosh, that's great. Thanks for coming forward.
Hi. So
Yes.
you mentioned that there's these various penalties for fathers and mothers involved in the science, and correct me if I got this wrong, but a lot of this comes from the workplace. I was wondering if you could speak into what type of pressure comes from within the family concerning the roles of fathers as scientists or mothers as scientists, and kind of how that plays out.
In terms of pressure about family life or work life or like social expectations kinds of things?
Yeah, kind of like how the penalties arise in different ways from within the family rather than from without.
Yeah. So our study mainly asked people about their experiences in the scientific workplace, but in an unintended way, so we didn't ask it, but it also often came up that scientists felt pressures from spouses. They also felt pressures from families of origin and expectations, so in-laws and their own parents, say to be a particular kind of parent, so to have, a certain number of children, right? The in-laws or parents wanted grandchildren, and they're like, well, I'm working on my career as a scientist, and this is a lot of years in training, so I'm going to delay childbearing, and that being a difficulty for extended family. So those kind of social pressures came up in our interviews to some extent. Also, pressures that spouses put on one another in marital relationships, so pressures to be a certain kind of parent, to be at a certain level of availability for children, or to do certain things with the children. Critique of the other parent for not being the kind of parent that they wanted them to be, or things like that. Is that what you're thinking of? Yeah. So those things came up. Now, are the faculty allowed to ask questions? Okay.
Did you find any difference in different disciplines of science in relation to the work-family conflicts? Were there more like in biology or physics?
Yeah. So I've written some articles that compare the disciplines. So if you want to know more about this, I'm happy to even be in email contact with you and send me some of those. So physics has a vastly lower proportion of women than biology. So I wonder if, I can't remember if I kept this slide or not. I think I did, so. So this is kind of interesting, right? So here's the percentage of men and women in top 20 US PhD departments. So, at the graduate student level in physics, we start out in really different places, right? So 80% graduate students are men, and less than 20% are women. In biology, there's more. No, I don't want to do that. I have to click. There we go. All right, great, thank you. In biology, there's more parity, but then as you go through the ranks, and my co-author and I did some interesting kind of analyses where we looked over time at the proportion of women we might expect to be full professors in biology given the proportion who enter as graduate students. And so there is significant attrition, so leaving the career as you go forward. So I think these dynamics have an impact on biology and physics. But here's what we also found, though, is that it's not just enough to have women in a discipline. So it's a necessary condition, but not a completely sufficient condition. So still cultures, we found very pervasive cultures within biology science departments where being an involved parent was not encouraged, for example. There were ways in which department chairs kind of discouraged involvement, or discouraged women from having children or wanting to be especially involved in their children's lives, and discouraged men from that as well. So So there, I would say, like, attention to the proportion of women in a discipline or in a corporation, or I think this can apply to other types of workplaces as well, is very important. So trying to bring more women in and bringing women into power positions in particular. So it may be a necessary condition, but I still think there are other things culturally that need to change beyond just increasing numbers. So that's some of the distinctions. And there were also different reasons. My co-author and I have written quite a bit about the reasons that scientists give for the underrepresentation of women in science. And there are different reasons among the disciplines that they give, which is really fascinating and really fun stuff and troubling stuff to read about in the interview. So I can give you lots of things to read if you really get interested in that topic. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So I am an engineer, and I found that in the engineering field, especially at these sort of elite universities, there's often a very international group of faculty. And I was curious if the sort of cultural background that they come from, or that is represented in the faculty, had an impact as to what you were finding with the family work culture in some of these departments.
Yeah, actually with both projects we found that. So in my broader work on science and religion and what scientists think about religion, the international nature of science at elite research universities has an impact, quite a profound impact on that conversation. So at top US universities, depending on the university, as many as 40% of science faculty are born outside the US. So it's a hugely international environment. Mostly East Asian, South Asian, some African nations. So this is a really big deal. So and coming from very different religious cultures than in the U.S. as well, and also very different ways of thinking about family and work. So the answer is yes, but my co-authors and I, some of the students and I at Rice are writing some articles about that right now, sort of the immigrant experience in science and things like that. So.
Hi. I'm interested in whether your religious understandings of science project looked at climate change denial and whether Christian rejection of climate change science is also rooted in theological concerns.
Very much so. So there's, I wrote an article in a journal called Environment and Behavior. If you want to look at it, it's on I think a copy of it's on my website, but if it's not, you can email me. And we found that these vision of God and vision of humans, those two issues came up with a relationship to the environment as well. So the idea, almost, I hate to use theological terms in this crowd because there are some real theologians in the room, but almost a kind of dispensational theology where, the world's going to burn, so you don't need to take care of it. God's in control, we really need to be about saving souls. So these, kind of a bunch of different kind of theologies really, but came up in narratives. So there was definitely that, but there was also a narrative of care for the earth based on a very particular vision of God, right? So the idea that Christians have a moral commandment to really be the leaders in caring for the earth. Jews talk about this a lot in their vision of healing of the earth and justice for the earth. So that came up. Also, the uniqueness of humans came up a lot when talking about environmental care. So the idea that, environmental activists put animals on the same playing field as humans, and we ought to be much more concerned about children who are starving than we are about saving polar bears. This kind of narrative came up over and over again. And what creative Christian environmental activists are doing, I think, are really teaching the church that environmental care is a justice issue for human beings as well, and that the communities, which are of course most disadvantaged by decline in the environment, tend to be the poorest communities, right? The poorest nations and the poorest communities even within the richest nations. So you think about, You don't live next to a factory that's giving off pollution if you have an option to live somewhere else, right? You move. So those two issues came up a lot. Climate change, we actually just had Al Gore on the Rice University campus, and like I sat next to him. It was very weird. I mean, it was very, not because he's weird. I'm not even making any kind of political statement, but it's like, what do you do there, right? You just say, hey, hi. I mean, they're like, do you have, questions to ask him? I'm like, no, I don't. Anyway, and then he left. But the climate change is a really interesting issue because climate change, I mentioned Al Gore deliberately because climate change has been so merged with a particular form of democratic politics that it has become a political issue, right? Rather than a spiritual issue or a religious issue for some people. And so we actually found in our research that political views tended, if you separate, there's ways you could do this statistically, if you separate them out from religious views, that political views are really the driver in whether or not you assent to climate change or not. So you kind of think it's the Fox News Christians who are against, are sort of climate change deniers, if you want to use that phrase. And that's kind of interesting. And our research actually found that people who, even from fairly conservative traditions who attend church more, are actually more likely to be affirmers of climate science than are people who attend church less. So once you get into what that said to us is once you get into a practicing faith community, you actually are more on board with these kinds of things than you are if you're not. If you're sort of saying you're a Christian but not really participating much, and you're merging that with politics, then you're not necessarily pro climate change. So that's kind of interesting. It's kind of a long-winded answer, but that's kind of a complicated topic.
I was just wondering, when you were studying the congregations and interviewing them, if there was a difference in answers between men and women.
Oh, that's a great. So we're writing an article right now on gender and politics and science. So we're kind of throwing that all together. Yeah, I just like to talk about everything controversial all at once, all the time. So fun to be with me. So there are gender differences. There's not huge gender differences on survey data on these issues that we talk about in the book. So in terms of climate change, environmental care, human genetic reproductive technologies, so gender didn't really figure in so much there. In our studies of scientists, when we talk about, there's one question on our survey when we talk about sort of your abstract views of collaboration or conflict between religion and science as concepts. So we ask our survey respondents, both scientists and the general public, whether they think that science and faith are in conflict, or they collaborate, or they're independent. And we did find women more likely to have a collaboration view, which is interesting. I'm not sure exactly what to do with that, but that was a kind of interesting gendered effect that we're exploring a little bit. I'm assuming it's me, but I don't know that it is.
It could be I. I'm struck by the various adjectives you place in front of university when you speak of your research sample. Mm-hmm. Elite, mm-hmm. Research, top 20.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if the various conflicts you speak of and address are differently constructed at places like this one. Not so much because this is a church-related place, and those other places are not. So to be a professing Christian who is an academic scientist at an R1 place or at an elite place where faith is sort of tapped down, the ideal scientist puts faith at arm's length. Different than at a place like this. I'm thinking more that this is a teaching university, mm-hmm. and not a research university, mm-hmm. Where priority is given to what takes place in the classroom and not what takes place at the bench. And I'm wondering, especially for academic scientists, if constructions of what the ideal looks like, or how to stage manage relationships between what research is done over and against family stuff, over and against student stuff, results in a very different looking profile or a very different understanding of conflict. And I'm wondering if you have taken the set of questions that you are asking into places like this place, a teaching university, a private place, even sectarian place maybe, but not necessarily. I'm thinking mostly the difference between a research university and a teaching university, and how science gets practiced at places like that.
So we have done some of that research. The first two studies were just of feeder PhD programs. So looking at science and religion, what scientists think about religion at top 20 PhD granting programs, and looking at family life and science. So those were intentional studies of those particular kinds of contexts. And I think for good reasons. So those places tend to produce a disproportionate number of PhDs who teach at all kinds of places. So they do have a particular kind of institutional influence. But in our second study of religious understandings of science, we did a very intentional oversample of scientists of all types. So in that population, we had people who taught at community colleges, people who taught at four-year institutions, people who are scientists outside of a university context, which was particularly interesting. And those people had very different views of the religion and science relationship than people at top institutions. And so there's been, for some reason, maybe you can tell me why, psychologists historically and some sociologists have been very interested in this question. Are people at elite institutions different than people at other kinds of institutions in their views in the religion and science relationship? And the thinking for many, many years is that scientists at elite institutions know more about science and are somehow better scientists, and once you know more about science, then you necessarily are negative towards religion or let go of religion. And so I have huge problems with those studies because they really assume the conflict in the entire framing of the whole question. So I think it's also wrong to assume that people who are teaching at elite institutions necessarily know the most about science. And there's a kind of elitism built into the study itself. And so our research, I think, has disproven some of those earlier studies. But even more importantly, I wonder if people at elite institutions are socialized into particular kinds of perspectives on these issues. So, I mean, it could be that there's a sort of, as you go sort of up, if you want to call it that, in the eliteness scale, you know, maybe it is that you know more about science or something, and there's sort of a knowledge thing that's going on. But I think it's much more likely that it's a socialization thing that's going on, or a self-selection thing that's going on, where perhaps people are self-selecting into those kind of institutions because they want to be sort of maniacally devoted to science at the expense of everything else, or because, you know, there's ways in which you can think about self-selection, and I have some evidence for that, which is that when we ask people their religion at age 16 and then their religion now, that scientists at elite institutions disproportionately come from non-religious homes. It's actually pretty hard to find a large group of second-generation atheists, meaning that you were raised in an atheist home. That just doesn't exist very much in the US. It's a fairly religious culture. It does in the science community at those kinds of institutions. So a disproportionate number of second-generation atheists. So there's some evidence for what you're saying for sure. I wouldn't say it's entirely, it's not entirely conclusive evidence, but I think there is some good evidence that it's maybe self-selection and socialization, and that elite scientists are different in some ways with relationship to religion and science and maybe other things.
Hey, I have a question about where do you find more Christian scientists at? So do you find them more at academia or in places of research, like in companies like, I don't know.
Intel or
Yeah.
Bosch and Lomb or whatever.
But and like, if you see a discrepancy between the two, is there a reason why you see them?
Yeah, I think for some things that, these same kinds of issues that we were just talking about here. So people who work as scientists in research and development or in corporations are very similar to the general public in their attitudes towards religion. They're actually are about the same. There's a little bit of underrepresentation. There's about the same proportion of evangelicals, for example, in mainline Protestants as there is in the general population. There is a pretty radical difference when you compare the general population religiously to scientists who teach at places like Stanford and Harvard and Princeton. They tend to be disproportionately religious, and people who are conservative Catholics, and really Catholics in general, not just conservative Catholics, but Catholics and evangelicals are pretty vastly underrepresented. Now, why is that the case? I'm not exactly sure. I do think that evidence does point a bit towards socialization. There's a bit of a turn. So I actually compared my survey data on scientists to surveys that have been done of U.S. faculty over the years. The Carnegie Commission did some historic surveys of faculty, so I replicated those surveys. There does seem to be actually an uptick in the religiosity of younger scientists. So I don't know if that points to, I don't think it's a large enough uptick to point to a sea change in religious belief, but there does seem to be more graduate students and postdoctoral fellows who are religious when compared to older faculty. It may be a life course matter. I don't think it is. Our data points towards actually a generational change rather than a life course kind of thing. So.
I was thinking about how there are class differences in terms of parental care.
Yeah.
And the type of effort that parents are expected to put forth, and cross-cultural differences.
Social class differences?
Social class differences, and then also in cross-cultural differences as well. And I was wondering if any of that came out in your interviews that you did with male and female scientists and how they perceived their role as parents and as scientists.
Yeah, and I'm thinking back to the question you asked, the gentleman asked about sort of intra-family pressures, so within family pressures. So that did come out that across, so we've done a recent study of scientists in 8 different nations. So cultural differences in family expectations and are pretty important. So, and have an impact on science. So for example, women's and men's roles in India and Taiwan. We study India and Taiwan and Hong Kong. There are differences than other countries. And those countries are certainly not the same. So the sort of cultural differences, the national cultural differences are very important. Science is, whether or not you're talking about elite universities or not elite universities, science as a whole is an elite enterprise. Nature and science have both done research briefs on this recently, that science is disproportionately the province of the elite, social class-wise. People who get PhDs in basic science, are privileged by and large. So that's something that the science community itself is concerned about. So all that to say, I'm not sure we would have good data on social class differences. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, so like upper class parents are supposed to spend more time, like their kids are supposed to learn instruments and do sports and do all sorts of things. So there's a lot more time that's put into parenting, and I was kind of wondering if you saw, but it sounds like you didn't have enough sample of.
Yeah, I don't think we would know that. I would sort of just know that anecdotally from things scientists I said, that I interviewed. We didn't really ask systematic questions about that. So whether just sort of the amount of time required to parent in, like upper social class kinds of environments is putting an undue strain. Yeah, that's an interesting question. That's a really interesting question. People did talk a lot about having to take their children for lessons.
Causing problems with his
thanks for your talk.
Sure.
I'm not a sociologist, so this question may betray my ignorance, but you had the slide up there about different types of Christianity and Catholicism and what they thought about science as a whole. And I was just curious, you got Pope Francis, Jesuit, and PhD in chemistry, right? Is it? But I was curious if Pope Francis that had any sort of influence on the Catholic perspective on science.
Scientists who were Catholics, who I interviewed after he became Pope, did mention him. I mean, I think he's had an impact on the Catholic Church in general. I don't know how to measure what impact he would have on science, but that's an interesting question. The Catholic Church, I mean, I'm thinking about, traditionally, so here's where the Catholic Church came up a lot in the popular imagination of scientists was, the Galileo affair. So almost these are people like, some of whom would, I think, just know very little about religion, but everyone knows about Galileo. There's sort of version of what happened and how that's evidence that there is an inherent conflict between religion and science. And so that's interesting. But I did find among the Catholic scientists that we surveyed and interviewed for our research that they seem to have a lot at their disposal for thinking through science and faith issues. So it strikes me that this is just from the scientists that we interviewed in our study. This is not my own historical understanding. It seems that they are thinking a lot about these issues, had read a lot of books about science and faith, had a kind of vocabulary to talk about science and faith, perhaps more so than the Protestants in the sample. I also think Catholic higher education and private Catholic education is robust in the sciences in the U.S. in a way that has become a feeder for scientists. And we did find, comparing our survey data to previous surveys, that there is a rise in the proportion of Catholics in science, perhaps because of the prominence of Catholic higher education. So that's kind of interesting. Those are some Catholic tidbits that came out of the data. Yeah. You said one more. I'm going to let you.
Yeah, you're going to cut them off? Yeah, good job. Okay. My mic's not working anymore. One of the things I neglected to mention when I introduced Elaine is that she flew out from Houston this morning. If you've been following the weather in Houston, they shut down the airport because of ice storms. What that meant was that Elaine had to get up at 4:30 this morning Houston time, which is 2:30 our time, to make it here. She had a delayed flight in San Francisco. She did make it here barely, and it's time for her to go to bed. So I want to be a little